we're going to look at positive behavior supports and what the PBS system is for a school, and we'll look at all of the data they have for it. The most effective thing we can do as teachers is try to handle the problem behavior before it occurs. Prevent it from occurring is going to be our best bet, because if we're trying to be reactive, it's going to be less effective. The PBS system, interventions and supports, they can help us recognize the significance of the classroom management, what we do in our classroom, how that's going to affect students. Positive behavior supports, it's the only behavior program that's mentioned in the law. It is part of IDEA. It was first there in 1997. It's the only approach to addressing behavior that's specifically mentioned in the law. Anything else, that's the only one that is mentioned. The emphasis is on using the functional assessment for our more severe behavior students, and the positive approach is to encouraging the good behavior. It still currently remains in the law as of the revision they had in 2004. What the IDEA requires as far as a PBS system is that we have a positive behavior interventions and supports for the students who their behavior is severe enough that it impedes their learning, and that the behavioral assessments are being used when a child has a behavior, or if they do not have a behavior intervention plan, that we do behavior interventions and FBAs if they are then removed from school. If it is for behavior, we look at the manifestation of a child's disability and when behavior results in long-term removal. Like if we're going to recommend that we send them to a behavior school, things like that, and they don't already have an FBA in place, we have to do an FBA, and that is covered under IDEA. What's the difference between the positive behavior supports and just traditional approaches to student behavior is that it is proactive instead of reactive. Traditional approaches, we're going to react to the behavior when it's occurred. We want to try to stop it from occurring with the PBIS system. The traditional approach, you handle it on a student-by-student basis. With the PBIS, the problems are less likely to occur if you do handle it proactively. The PBIS focuses on ways to teach and reward behavior. We want to teach them what the proper behavior is, not just tell them that this is what you want to do. We want to teach them how to do that. What does it look like? What are those behaviors for the different areas? Because they are specific to different environments. What we want them to do in the cafeteria is different from what we want them to do in the hallway or what we want them to do in the classroom. We want to teach those behaviors. You have to use data. If you just tell them that you want them to do this with the PBS system, we want the data to drive that. We want to look at where are we not improving? What areas do we have worse behavior in? What areas can we improve upon? And we want to use the data to guide that. Because sometimes if we don't look at data, our emotions will get involved and we'll think things, certain things are a problem that are not. And so when you look at the data, it's a lot easier to determine where you need to focus. And interventions are used to identify the level of support necessary for the students to meet expectations. The interventions are going to be research-based interventions that have been proven to work. They're not specific interventions that you have to use. You need to be evidence-based. It's a frame. PBS is a framework. It's not just a solitary program. It's a whole bunch of different strategies that have been proven to be effective that you're going to put together based on the needs of your school or your students. Again, you're going to use the data to determine whether your approaches are working. If you are using an intervention and your behaviors are not decreasing, then obviously it's not working and we need to look at what else we can do. It's positive. You want to try to give them positive feedback. You teach students how to achieve the expected outcomes. You're going to model the behavior that you want in those environments, and you're going to provide relevant incentives for students to demonstrate desired behavior. You offer incentives to get them to display the behavior that you want. We all do that in our classrooms. We give tickets, we give points, they get extra recess with the buddy at lunch. Those are the things that are part of a PBIS program. And the consequences or punishments that are aligned to the function of the student's behavior. You want to make sure that your punishments, that when you do use them, that they are, you look at the function. A person's behavior is going to serve one of three functions: to avoid something, to get something, or a sensory function, because just they like the way it feels. You want, your behaviors need to match what the function is. I mean, your consequences need to match the function of their behavior. And the PBIS system is going to reflect specific values. Just like we have a pride matrix here for our school. We have all of those things. That's what they're talking about. Those are our values of our school. That's what we consider important, and we want to use that, and the PBS system should be based on that. We want to base our behaviors, our interventions, so that the behaviors we want, like being prepared, are being encouraged. The PBIS system is based, just like we have Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 for academics, you have the same thing for the behavior. You have Tier 1, which would be school-wide, and that's kind of everybody. You have Tier 2, are those students that need a little bit more help. They have check-ins or check-outs. And then Tier 3 are going to be those students that have the FBAs and the BIPs, and they've had those functional behavioral assessments, they have behavior intervention plans, and they just need intense behavioral training to be able to be successful. Just like with Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3 with academics, the behavior, your percentages should be about the same. You should have very few students that are in Tier 3, and you should have, a little bit more are going to be in Tier 2. Tier 1 is going to cover the majority of the students. If it's not covering the majority of the students, then we need to look at our interventions and determine what can we change so that we, can fix that little Tier 1 process. And Tier 1 supports for students and teachers, you need to teach them in the settings that they will be used. You should, for a good PBS system, for Tier 1, if you want to teach them about how to behave in the cafeteria, you want to do it in the cafeteria. If you want to teach them how to behave in the hall, we want to do it in the hall. They need to be specific to their environment, especially when you're working with the inclusion, the special ed population, because a lot of times their behaviors, they do not cross categories, they do not cross settings, they need it in every setting. For faculty and staff, you need time, the materials, and guidelines to do the lessons and to teach them in all of the areas that they need. You always want to provide praise and recognition for your students, and at the same, teachers want the same thing. They want to know that they're doing it correctly. They want feedback on what else they could do to improve it. You need to be consistent when addressing challenging behaviors for Tier 1, and use refresher lessons. The kids forget. After Christmas break would be a good time. After spring break would be a good time to refresh the students on what our expectations are in the different environments of the school. All right, Tier 2 supports, they should be proactive. Use screeners for early identification. We use our behavior screeners. When we get those coming out, that's part of the Tier 2 process for behavior. And if a large number of students are being identified for Tier 2, then we need to look at Tier 1 and figure out what else we can do to make them successful there, because there should not be a whole lot of students in Tier 2. We're going to use data. We use the data that we collect regularly to monitor effectiveness and progress, because just like with Tier 2 with academics, with behavior, you want to know whether it's working. Are the things that we're doing helping their behavior or hurting? And it should include a strategy to ensure interventions are being provided with fidelity. You want to make sure that the intervention is being done by with the same procedures by everybody. If I have an intervention and I want to say that it's working or not, I want to make sure that I'm doing it the same way for every student in Tier 2, or I want to make sure if that student goes to multiple teachers, that every teacher is doing the same big things that I'm doing, so that I can say the intervention is working and not just that it's the teacher, that there aren't other variables that are influencing it. It should be effective for the majority of students. And Tier 3, the intensity of Tier 3 should match the student's level of need. Tier 3, it builds on everything that you do in Tier 1, Tier 2, just like with academics, but it is more intensive until you can identify what is needed for students to be successful. Usually when you're looking at Tier 3, obviously we want to prevent problem behavior. You want to teach an acceptable replacement behavior, and that's very important. I know sometimes in the moment with my students, I get really frustrated with what's going on and I just want the behavior to stop, and I forget to teach them a replacement behavior. If you don't teach them what else to do, they may get better for a little while, but they're going to continue to do that behavior. They're going to fall back to that if they don't have something to replace it. Then you want to reward the student every time they use the replacement behavior, and minimize the payoff for problem behavior. If their behavior is based on the fact they don't want to do the work, then you need to minimize the time that they're not allowed to do the work. You need to make sure that they're not receiving what it is they want from that behavior, or the behavior will increase. Tier 3 resources are the FBA's baseline data and things like that. I have the Tier 3 resource, and it's like data collection tools. I talk very fast when I get nervous, and then it doesn't come out correctly. Sorry. Basically, what an FBA is what it's going to show you, is the ABC chart that you would use for an FBA. Okay, well, it was an ABC chart. There's an antecedent, the behavior, the consequence. Those are the tools that you're going to use if you have a Tier 3 student. If you have a student who's causing problems, if you go to our behavior specialist, that's the first thing they're going to ask is, do you have an ABC chart? What's happening before the behavior occurs? What does the behavior look like? And what consequence did you give the student? Those are just the 3 things that you need to put in it. And then in your classroom, you have to have 5 essential practices for a classroom PBS, and that's that you have good expectations and rules set up for your students, that your students are engaged, that you acknowledge when they're behaving appropriately. Sometimes we take for granted that we want them to sit in their seat and be quiet. A lot of students aren't going to do that unless you do acknowledge that they're doing it. Respond to inappropriate behavior. You do want to respond. Sometimes you do have to use planned ignoring, where you know that their only reason for their behavior is attention and you just don't give it to them. And then maximize structure of a classroom, especially when you have some of the special needs students. They really need the structure and the routines, expectations and rules. They need to know what to expect, because a lot of times with special needs students, their behaviors get worse when they don't have good expectations of what's required of them. Let's see, as it works. These are examples of the routines and procedures in the classroom, and Marzano's planning questions. The planning questions were things, it's not gonna work, that with the planning questions you have like, what I want the students to do if they finish early? What do I want the students to do if I'm dealing with this? Have all of those questions answered before you get to class. Or if you have good answers to those questions, you won't have as much downtime and it will decrease negative behavior in the classroom. Also, if you have routines and procedures set up in your classroom that are specific to your students and effective and consistently applied, then you have less behavior in your classroom. And that's always that you can be proactive in preventing undesired behavior. This is our ODRs for our school district, just 4th and 5th grade, for 2017-2018 school year, and it's broken down into category. And so I was going to let us look at this, and then I'm going to ask y'all what y'all think is something we could do with our PBS system here at our school, or something you've noticed that we do, because I know there are things. Because you see, for bus discipline is where our highest number is, and the thing right below that, the only other thing that's the next one would be inappropriate behavior. But our bus discipline definitely is where we have the most problems.
Well, we've done some things, you know.
We have. So what have we done?
Well, I've got a monitor on one bus that has taken a considerable amount of discipline down already.
Do y'all know? Have y'all noticed anything else?
Incentive.
It's part of our incentive. And that's the way a PBS system works, is when they used our data and we looked at that and said, okay, well, using our data and our ODRs, we see that this is somewhere that we're having a whole lot of problems. So what can we do to prevent that? So in an effort to prevent it, we are offering that as an incentive. We had that every 9 weeks, and we've done things like that. Can y'all think of any other changes that we could make to decrease undesirable behavior?
What we need to do